I'm so delighted to be here and to have this very generous invitation from Giulia Fabiani, from Rona, and all the people who've contributed to this marvellous exhibition. And I'm very grateful indeed for this occasion to talk to you, although you're a small, very select audience, because it gives me a chance to not only verbalize my thoughts and talk about my own personal encounter with Judit Reigl, which was so recent but so important for me, but also to show some images in terms of comparative material that won't be shown, of course, in the exhibition catalogue. One of the problems with working on artists like Judit Reigl and of the period of Judit Reigl is that while with Picasso, for example, and the Cubist period, art historians know all the contextual material, all the works of the Cubists who weren't Picasso, all the poets who at the time were working around Picasso, like Apollinaire, Pierre Revedi, and so forth. Because of the monographical way in which both books are made and which exhibitions are made, this contextual work still remains to be done to a very great extent on work on the period of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Even in a capital like France, the French art historical establishment is a very, very strange beast, as I'm sure Rona knows, although it's becoming much more enlightened at the moment. But still, if you think of the big Pompidou retrospectives like Simon Antaille recently, there is no contextual material. I have been working, thanks to Germain Viat, who opened the exhibition yesterday and who invited me to work with him as a very young student at the Pompidou Center. I've been working on the period in which Judit Reigl herself functioned for a very, very long time. So when I was asked by Giulia to contribute to this exhibition, of course, first of all, I was very excited. It gave me an urgent reason to go and visit Judit. But also, of course, I saw the mass of fantastic catalogues and superb reproductions that have already been made by the Kálmán Makláry Gallery here, by people working in New York. On my previous trip to Budapest, I met Agnes Beres, who's written so marvelously and who is shown in the exhibition actually using her body in her excitement to compare Judith's work with Pierre Soulages. That's a little bit I saw. She's written so very well. My problem was to find something to say that hadn't already been said. And so I just will, in this case, as I say, share with you some of the enlightenment about Judith's work, which I knew, it was not my first introduction, because although I knew her as a name, I knew her work visually. In about 202, 203, I was approached by a friend of hers, a Hungarian man, not Hungarian actually, a man whose origins were in Berlin, called Peter Zander. And he lent me a lot of catalogues going right back to the mid-90s. I think he was a close friend of Judith's in the mid-90s. He was quite a Soho character, kind of actor, and I think he had some relationship with Cornwall, where Judith and her friend Betty used to go in the summer. And he said, I must get to know her work better. He showed me in the wake of 2000, September 9/11 attacks, he showed me the work she'd done of falling men. He lent me many catalogues. And I have in my archives drawings of the écriture, little pen and ink drawings that Judith herself sent me with thank you notes in 2004. So I had some personal relationship with her, but hadn't been to visit her. And when I did, of course, I learnt very much more. Now, mythologically speaking, and all artists have a kind of mythological trajectory. Am I supposed to be speaking here? Yes, I think this is better. Mythologically speaking, Judith's trajectory begins with after she's come back and installed herself in Paris, which was the most important intellectual and artistic metropolis after the war for European artists, and indeed for, say, Japanese, for everybody who wasn't in America or New York. After she'd made that break and established herself in Paris, the great moment is, as you know, when Antaille introduces her to André Breton. And as you know, this is the picture on the left called They Have an Insatiable Thirst for the Infinite, the title coming from the French poet Ludwig that she showed to André Breton. Now, Judith isn't here and I can speak very freely. My problem is I really don't particularly like this painting. And I don't think it really expresses Judith's interiority, as nearly all the rest of her painting does. In fact, when Breton saw it, as you possibly know as well, he wanted to exhibit it immediately, and she said, no, I want to wait, I want to do more. And it was much later on that she had an exhibition of her surrealist work, involving, for example, works like this on the right, where there's much more swirling and scraping that goes forward into her work. And when I talk about this in my essay, I quote a later encounter when the philosopher Louis Althusser, who hadn't previously written about art, was taken to meet a surrealist, a Cuban surrealist. And he was plunging himself into writing about art, but he realized that this guy coming from Cuba had learnt in Paris, learnt surrealism like a language, rather late in the day. And he says, well, Alberto de los Rios has learnt surrealism like a language, or indeed like a church, with its Latin and its syntax and its masses. And it seems to me in this monstrous painting on the left that Judith is going through some kind of disciple-like process, which she is soon going to shed almost immediately after her exhibition of surrealist paintings. She writes to Breton and says, I can't come to your meetings anymore. Basically, she'd grown out of him, and he was also leaving his surrealist phase. He was already, even before her exhibition in November 1954, surrounding himself with gestural painters like Degotex. So this is a funny moment, and I prefer to take, for me, the painting that greeted me as I entered Judith's studio. I came to see her on a kind of greyish day in Marcoussis, having made this enormous pilgrimage by train and by taxi. And when one enters her studio, it is very dark, and the light shines from the street through onto this painting, which is much, much more luminous than this reproduction, and very significantly for what I'm going to say, is hung much higher than it is in the show here. And what I find interesting about the painting, which is when she went to Italy, the discovery of Italy was like the French would say, an éblouissement, a kind of dazzling experience for her. Her first encounter with old masters like Giotto. And there's a great deal of the Italian primitives in this painting, as you can see, with its receding perspective, its exaggerated vanishing point. These three little heads looking up into the sky like angels. Judith, her new companion, who would be her lifelong companion, the Englishwoman Betty Anderson, and a friend called Paul de Boom. But the thing that interested me, which relates later on to Judith's engagement with psychoanalytic language, at this time she hasn't thought about that at all, is that if you imagine this painting high, and of course it's got this arch as though, like a Giotto, as though it's actually created for a religious architecture, your eyes are drawn upwards to the vanishing point, but the eyes of the painting, i.e. the lorry headlights, are actually coming at you. And the painting is actually, although not these little eyes, the painting is actually looking at you. And this is what happens much later on, of course, in Judith's work. Because, of course, she will change to paintings like this, which are so magnificently visible in the exhibition. This is called éclatement in French, which is like, it's translated as outburst, but it's also like an explosion. Later on, when Judith is describing her escape from Hungary, she talks about the dark night with these lit windows of houses that are racing past. She both sees a train coming towards her, and she sees a little orange glints in the darkness. And that relationship between orange and black and the idea of dangerous explosion or retreat is always part of her work. Of course, I'm not actually reading here from my catalogue text, which is more academic, but I'm really sharing more of the feeling and response I had with Judith to her work. And then, of course, when I saw works like this, where through what was a kind of black on white, slightly orientalist gesturalism, these feelings come towards one. This paint, which is red, can, of course, be read as some kind of blood, and the painting itself, the image can be read as some kind of wound. I talked to Judith about the painters previously that she appreciated. And like all painters who are alive, and I know the organisers of the exhibition know this, she's very agitated when one's own opinions don't coincide with hers and her own account of the past. But one of the painters she appreciated a great deal, and whom I'll show you again in a moment, is called Jean Fautrier. He was one of the most important painters in my life as a student of the School of Paris in all its richness. And we know that Judith at the time was reading a lot of Georges Bataille. She quotes him. And when Bataille, writing about Fautrier, in a period as dark as Judith escaping from Hungary, the French occupation, he talked about turning the wound into a fate. His words in French, which are very beautiful, and which mean, don't think just about misery, think about what you can turn into something positive, is faire de la blessure une fête, turn a wound into a fate. And it seems to me in these paintings where the body is starting to come through just through the use of colour, but we haven't already encountered the Homme series, there is possibly the sense of wound, and yet in terms of Judith's energy, there is a kind of dialectic between wound and celebration. And so, like Bataille said of Fautrier, there is this idea of faire de la blessure une fête. But when we come to the Centre de Dominance paintings, and of course, going around the real paintings yesterday and seeing how many of them belong to Kálmán Makláry as well, including this one, I was extremely envious. But you can see how this is not only a vortex sucking you in, but it's one of these, it's now part of a French gestural school. It's flat. There's no receding perspective like in the Giotto. It's not only sucking you in, but like in that early painting, it's also looking at you. This is the moment when the theories of Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, about the gaze, the regard, and the constitution of the self in the gaze of the other, were being replaced by a new reading around Jacques Lacan, who was, of course, his lectures were so incredible as experiences. The whole of Paris was flocking to his lectures. And he is the one who talked about the way that he uses a metaphor of a sardine tin floating on the waves and someone saying, "Can you see it?" "No, but it's looking at you." So you always have this idea of the painting retaining the energy with which it was made, and then that energy coming out and looking at you. Of course, this is not to do, of course, with the idea of the male body, but in these squares, you can see the beginnings, perhaps, of a torso. And she has one painting very similar to this. This is the only one I could find, which is called something like Dancing Breaking Out of the Square, a most amazing title. These blocky forms become animate, and then, of course, it seems to me an extraordinary kind of miracle. I know you can just walk into the exhibition and see a lot of these Homme paintings, but if you think, I like to think, even as in my practice as an art historian, not of looking at the work and analysing it, but thinking of the work before it was made and at its point of genesis. It seems to me to turn those inky gestures in a situation in Paris where there was an enormous school of painters doing gestural abstraction, many doing deliberately Orientalist stuff, to make this torso come through, I think is really quite extraordinary. And when I was trying to write and trying to think of things other people hadn't said, I was remembering how Judith, when I met her, was talking to me about how she was brought up in this very, very strict convent school for a moment, with terrible, terrible admonitions about hell,
and heaven, and how, of course, when she was in Italy, she would have gone to Rome and seen the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's Last Judgment, and seen the idea of torsos in the sky. If you look in the paintings of Michelangelo with these great big muscly guys up on the ceiling, these aren't the first muscly people in the sky. They're very, very, very fleshly and powerful up there. And if you see Tintoretto's Angels, I always remember my first Tintoretto's Angels, because in the National Gallery in London we have kind of nice seated Tintorettos. When you see St. Mark, which is like an enormous great guy upside down going, it's really quite an extraordinary experience. And I feel that Judith's encounter with old master painting in Italy was not just the encounter with the Italian primitives and their light. I make analogies later between Judith and another woman from Eastern Europe who comes to Paris and is so important for her, Julia Kristeva, who wrote a marvellous essay called Giotto's Joy. So Judith's encounter is not just with the Italian primitives, but with the great figures of the Renaissance. Of course, these are all great painters, and she wants to be a great painter too. And so it's extremely interesting to me in terms of her desire, bearing in mind her own sexuality, because she is always living with this very literary and very also a woman of great character, Betty Anderson. It's very amazing to me that these men come almost insisting on appearing through the canvas. And you will see how she uses a lot of very psychoanalytic language in her own writing about her work. But then what is so extraordinary to me is how she plays with perspective. This doesn't seem to have been written about, because even the great writers on her work, like Marcellin Plenet, who is her most important and supremely important male advocate, so important now that one cannot even speak to him without going through about 3 secretaries in his literary offices in Paris, in the Édition du Seuil. He shied away from these works. And yet, if you think of where the viewpoint is, the viewpoint of these works is looking down like this. And even more extraordinary, this is my favourite, if you think of the foreshortening of the body in this, so that if you came into the room and you didn't know Judith Reigl and you didn't know that series, you wouldn't read this as a foreshortened body at all in any way. It had a very funny effect on my psyche to think of this. Of course, I'm not talking about the very late falling pieces, as an extraordinary kind of invention. And the only analogy I could produce, but I don't think it is without reason, and it may, I hope, be reproduced in my essay, is this very unknown drawing which inspired Salvador Dali. He knew about it. It's the actual drawing that St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic, did of Christ on the cross as a gesture towards a nun who was grieving. It was a kind of letter and a drawing he made for this nun, and it's become put into a reliquary in a monastery in Spain. But this is so weird because it is God's perspective. It's not the perspective, you remember I said about looking up and looking down, it's not the perspective of us time and time and time again looking up at crucifixions in churches, looking up at the focal point of the male torso. It is actually God's perspective looking down onto the crucifixion. And it seems to me, just to go back again, that Judith's invention of this perspective is really a very, very extraordinary thing, which adds, of course, the dimension of spirituality to something which one could see as a very bodily type of invention. So much for St. John of the Cross. And then what is extraordinary is that she describes how, having created this very strong series, she faced a kind of impasse, and she felt that her works were failures. And at a certain moment, she describes her release from that moment of non-production and dissatisfaction and even treading on all her canvases by hanging the Homme paintings and concealing them with a white sheet that goes round her atelier. And then, not exactly painting on top of them, but allowing a kind of gentler and more ethereal type of body to come through. And later on, I have her own description of how she makes these, but I think I won't read from my text. She kind of, it's an awfully strange idea to bind or swaddle your own studio and hide your own paintings with white. But she does that, and then these rather ethereal and angelic, and yet using this colour of paint again, very, very material bodies come through. And as you can see in this installation shot, this is all done on one long piece of industrial cotton on one bale. I don't think in terms of the light fittings that this is the original installation of these pieces. I had only seen these pieces reproduced as individual works in Kálmán Makláry's beautiful catalogues. And so when I was looking up the original places of publication of her writings, and in the Cahiers de Psychologie et de l'Art, this incredible publication made by the School of Fine Arts in Paris in the 1980s, where the most interesting psychoanalysts and the most interesting psychoanalytic art critics are writing together with one or two artists' interventions. This is the first time I suddenly learnt so much more about Judit Reigl. When I saw these installation shots, I saw that these were not flat images, but were images done on a folding sheet of material, which, as you can see, even in this shot, has already been cut into pieces. So, and this is where she publishes this incredible text in 1985, where she talks about the relationship between the body and its explosion into atoms and into light, from celestial bodies, planet bodies, all sorts of bodies. And in the middle of the text, I think you can make out the names of the kind of great tradition that she's following. She talks about Titian, Giorgione. She talks about the tradition of painting women's bodies as well, Dubuffet, Courbet's Origin of the World, and then the more spiritual things like Grunewald's Christ. And actually, I think if one wanted a Grunewald Christ painting for the later 20th century, I think this amazing series called Drap Décodage is the series. Even in its seriality, it's moving from that point of view in its non-exclusiveness. And of course, it is here again that one can make a comparison between Judith and Fautrier, because there is the sense of softness and sensuality in these works goes back to a kind of softness that you get in the earliest paintings of Fautrier, where he is working, of course, on women's bodies. This is the period when Georges Bataille is writing about Fautrier. This is a painting called La Juive, the Jewish woman, and it is recalling terrible, terrible massacres that were happening in occupied Paris when people were taken out to the boundary walls and shot and raped and mutilated. And what is very disturbing in them is the asceticism of the treatment of something so horrific, and the colours of Watteau, of the painter Watteau's Fête Galante, the pink and the green. And of course there's always the analogy between women's bodies and nature and men and culture. And of course, what's so interesting in this series is that Judith turns the male body back into nature here. It is the male body that is becoming a kind of beautiful, pale, translucent landscape, rather than that former, very tedious antithesis. André Breton, when he met us, said he was absolutely astonished that a woman could do such strong work. That was immediately a put-down. That was immediately something Judith then spends her career trying to redress. And in fact, when I met her, the question I asked her was, what was he really like, Breton? And she immediately said, une lionne, a lioness. Her riposte was immediately to feminize Breton, which I found absolutely terrific. This was in the first few minutes of meeting her. So this relationship between the tradition of male artists painting women's bodies and Judith painting men's bodies and women and culture and men and culture and women and nature, and her reversal of it, I find absolutely moving here. This is the other side of that installation because, of course, they can be hung like this. This is after Yves Klein did his so-called peintres suaires, which were pressed, of course, on women's bodies, but were held up as transparent bodies with a relationship, in his case, to the Shroud of Turin. Those were in 62, these are 66. But you can see how very interestingly the light shines through them and they become ethereal and angelic, even at this moment. But it is when she describes in this catalogue her making of the guano paintings as the kind of base antithesis to those angelic paintings that it becomes so interesting. This is not the first catalogue that Judith had in the Galerie Rencontre, and it was the discovery of this gallery and its work which Judith was the kind of presiding spirit of that was so interesting for me. You can see in this preface she says that her first exhibition in this gallery, which Betty Anderson, her companion, was the real director of, she first showed her Man series, in May 1972. And then she describes here how and this is interesting because I have no visual image of the gallery, but she says there were two basement stories, dans les deux sous-sols, two basements. I think probably this was two basement rooms on one story. But you actually had to go down, and underneath those floating men were her series called Guano, which we have, of course, displayed in the exhibition here. And these paintings, as we all know, were paintings that she made after this great sense of dissatisfaction with her work, trampling on her previous work, walking all over it, finally recuperating it, and also kind of making a painting out of it, scraping it, adding white. Of course, there's this great big doorway here. And much earlier, which is like a barrier with the escape and the unknown outside, of course. But in my essay, I talk about the trope of catabasis, which is something in the earliest myths. It's like Orpheus's descent to the underworld, which is, of course, as you know, linked to a myth of rebirth, so important for Judith. It's like Dante's descent with Virgil into the underworld in Virgil's Aeneas, and it's also like the little Hungarian folk tale, which is obviously based on those big stories, the little Hungarian folk tale that she quotes of the bagpipe player, that she recalls when she discovers her letter. It's a letter when she says bye-bye to André Breton. She recalls that this bagpipe player was actually the theme of music by Béla Bartók and a poem by Joseph Attila. But this idea of descent, which is a necessary descent before rebirth, I think is very, very interesting in these paintings. But as I said, my problem was to find one or two original things to say, and I think my possibly fanciful, but for me interesting contribution to thinking about these Guano series and their relationship with painting men and the problem of her as a woman painting is this trope of the woman who is trampling on things, which in French is called la femme qui piétine. And I understood that I'll show you my next two slides. I understood that this was a trope, la femme qui piétine. And this is a painting by Jean Eliant of the 1980s of the woman model releasing herself from subjugation to the male artist and stamping on the male artist. Amazing. So I worked with Eliant in the mid-80s before he died. And these were some of his last paintings, and I thought they were a bit strange. But this is how I understood there was this idea of la femme qui piétine. This even turned into a French postage stamp. But then I discovered in the museum in Lille, and of course there are many, many, many versions of this. This is a very ancient idea. It's to do with the the learned St. Catherine of Alexandria, who was such a learned and saintly woman. She was able to convert the whole of Alexandria, although the awful emperor Maximentius kept trying to stop her at every turn and, I don't know, fire arrows at her or whatever. She, of course, becomes a martyr, but this medieval idea of the female saint trampling the pagan emperor is something which rather corroborates this idea. So to go back to these extraordinary guano paintings and think of actually how they were made, and the point is that Judith has never really allowed people, except through writing, to see her making processes. I think it's extraordinarily interesting to think of her kind of tramping on tradition, not only as self-criticism, because these begin with her own idea that these paintings are not good enough for her. So there's an element of self-criticism in them, but there's the kind of learned woman who's trampling on the tradition, which I like as well, which she then upends, like Fautrier, Yves Klein, they all painted on the flat and then upended their work. And these works become a kind of gravestone or monument. I think these are very, very interesting and profound works in which the making is part of the meaning. And of course, at this time, if you think of those very beautiful, flimsy drapes, she's having to compete with her contemporaries, the Support Surface group. I'm not at the moment going to bother to make any comparisons with Antiquaires. The fact is that this big group were very, curiously enough, rather feminine in their painting, but very masculine in their group behaviour and also their espousal at the time of very, very strong Maoist theory. This antithesis is so strange that I've published an essay called Between Matisse and Duchamp, because they used the colour of Matisse and the idea of ready-mades from Duchamp. The féminin masculin, the feminine masculine of Support Surface. These are just what I was able to procure. These aren't the best possible images, but this is François Rouen, who also wove a lot of his canvases, which is a very female thing to do, and Noël Dollar, who, as you see, for some reason, his ready-mades were like women's washing lines, but this wasn't considered at all female at the time. There's a very funny thing going on in gender at this moment when structuralism in Paris is really a means of taking everything to pieces, taking the very premises of the canvas, the stretcher, the painting as window, the painting as cloth, the kinds of writing that were going on, taking everything to pieces. And this is the milieu in which Judith was competing. But it's Judith herself, after a long period of not having a one-person show, who goes herself to the most important critic of the period, Marcellin Plénet, whom you see on the left, who himself is evolving this new psychoanalytic art criticism. He just told me on the phone when I asked him that Judith made the first approach to him, but I would like to ask them both at greater length about this encounter, because it was of extreme importance. And incidentally, while you see this picture of Plénet, this is a later picture of him in his office, but the enormous piece of Chinese calligraphy behind him just reminds you that at this period of the early 60s as well, mid-60s, everybody in Paris was crazy about China, about Mao, about calligraphy. And this review that Plénet was the editor of from 1962, Peinture Cahier Théorique, this is the special number on China, I think. And it is the kind of writers in this review, Philippe Solers, Julia Kristeva, who are the writers who are writing their own manifestos, the Support Surface members. I won't enumerate all the names you don't possibly know. It is this milieu that Judith intellectually desires to become part of. And what happens, which is so incredible, is that basically she invites Marcellin Plénet to curate whatever he likes and what he desires to do in this space that Betty has, basically, although she hasn't said it in so many words, financed, I suppose. My supposition, which I don't have any corroboration for, is that possibly Betty's parents died and left her a legacy, and Betty, wondered what the most beautiful and interesting and important thing she could do. Anyway, this was basically the most beautiful and important thing she did. And together with Plénet, they produced I've only discovered this about 10 days ago, one of the most important experimental galleries in Paris that existed for a very small moment, which is where Marcellin Plénet was able to show the artists he desired to show. And this is the manifesto I found in the Bibliothèque Kandinsky. I do have the words of the manifesto here. This is what Plénet said. In this manifesto, I'm saying Plénet at this time was propelling the gallery towards a theoretical position under the rubric critique, théorie, art, criticism, and the practice of criticism, theory, art. And he says, with this title, the Galerie Rencontre, which means meeting place, of course, the Galerie Rencontre has decided outside the market of painting, so it's an anti-commercial enterprise, to organise a freely open forum where the various movements of modern art can dialogue together. Critics and theoreticians of art are invited to present as their sole initiative the artists they deem most representative and most likely to develop a critical and theoretical discourse. And this is where the catalogues they'd previously produced, including Judith's, and you saw in 1973, that was just one simple piece of paper. The catalogues became numbered catalogues of a periodical that he called Critique, Théorie, Art, which I think is just going to pop up. Hold on one second. And these are the catalogues, the 5 catalogues. They're like 1974 to 5. Because it didn't last very long as this theoretical magazine that Plénet made. But of course it means, and what is so amazing is that number 3 with the orange cover, for example, is entirely curated by Catherine Millet. Now, Catherine Millet was the most important writer about what one can call French conceptual art. She was the girlfriend of Daniel Templon, and the Daniel Templon was really the showcase for American and French. We don't even know anything about French conceptual art because the French have decided not to show us it, to tell us about it, do any historical retrospectives of it. Darling French people, but also American. And Catherine Millet wrote a book called 10 Years of Conceptual Art at the Galerie Daniel Templon, for example. But here she presents 5 artists, not very well-known artists, in fact. This is where Plénet represented his own boyfriend, James Bishop, because Plénet was a homosexual as well. And Agnès Martin, the amazing... Actually, I've got a slide of Agnès Martin. And what's so incredible is 2 years after Hans Hacker presented the Manhattan Holdings project in New York, one of the most important, iconic conceptual art pieces, which was a critique of American real estate holdings and capitalism. This was presented in basically Judith and Betty's space. So there was that, and for example, in that same catalogue, there's Michel Journiac, the great gay Catholic French conceptual artist and performance artist. This is a piece he made to be about French elections and the guillotine and capital punishment, because the French were still guillotining people at this stage, you may be interested to hear, in the 1970s. It's true, it was only abolished in 1977. This is Agnès Martin. I'm afraid there's my thumb here. But these are the pieces that were part of the conversation that Judith was in, and it's this conversation that has been lacking in monographical treatments. And then we come, of course, I'm zooming ahead from 75, when Plénet consolidates all his writing about her and writes a big monograph produced by the Galerie Rencontre with more psychoanalytic criticism than he allows when he writes in her retrospective. This number of Art Press comes after Judith's magnificent retrospective at the Musée de la Ville de Paris, which was held in December 1976. Now, this was really on a cusp. It was really like the end of a huge phase in the Paris art world. It was the end of the dominance of art conversation by the Musée de la Ville de Paris. The Musée de la Ville de Paris, the Municipal Museum of Paris, had been run by a kind of communist Althusserian, Pierre Gaudibert, and then by Suzanne Paget, who people in the art world will know very well because she's still curating. She's going to take over the Louis Vuitton space this very year in Paris. She's still on the go. In the 1970s, from 1971 onwards through to 1977, she held a magnificent series of retrospectives of women artists. It was the first one-person show of major women artists, of which I have a list with me, including Judith, rather late, 76, going on to Marina Abacanovich in 81 at the time of Solidarity, beginning with Ruth Franken, whose work I'll show you in a second. And so this was, but as I said, this was a moment when that big series of retrospectives was still on the go, but this is just the moment when the Pompidou Centre is going to open, which changes the conversation. The number of art press, Catherine Millet's new, very glamorous, much better subsidised review, which opens incidentally with a special number on Kossuth and Marcel Duchamp. So you know where you're going with that. The Pompidou Centre opens in late January. The February number is about the Pompidou Centre. And this number for International Women's Day on the 8th of March is about the women who were really the milieu of conversation in which I just like to suggest that Judith participates. And you see that she's not even in the bottom right-hand corner. The bottom right-hand corner is Meredith Monk. And right at the top, with this amazing philosophical star, Julia Kristeva, the interlocutor of Philippe Solers and of Marcelin Plenet is Judith Reigl. So this is really a marvellous thing. And if you look at the front, it says, I don't know actually, because of course some women sink without trace, Jeanne Ibard. But we have, this is the list of contents, it's easier to see. Julia Kristeva doing her feminist text, replying to the critic Catherine Franck-Blin as woman, mother, and thought. Then some people I don't really know. Lou Andrea Salome, this was the moment of the resurrection of the great first female psychoanalyst, friend and psychoanalysant of Freud, lover of Gropius, Nietzsche, and many others. I think she's got the best list of anybody, frankly, who, you know. And then Artemisia Gentileschi, the great Artemisia Gentileschi, who did the amazing painting of Judith chopping off Holofernes' head. Preceding or afterwards, I don't know which, the great exhibition about Artemisia Gentileschi with commissions from contemporary artists like Cy Twombly, contemporary women artists. It was held by the Galerie Lambert. Helen Frankenthaler. And then we get on, after Judith, of course, we get on to the American feminist milieu with which the French people were in contact with, people like Meredith Monk, but also I think I forgot to put in, I had a very good image of the Patti Smith article. Patti Smith is, of course, the wildest of these women, but she also is there. So the lineage is going from Lou Andrea Salome through Judith Reigl to Patti Smith at this incredible 1977 moment. And this is the place where Judith describes her escape from Hungary. Of course, in all the anthologies, we just have the description of that moment and people's deconstruction of it or skepticism of it or whatever. Let me just see if I've just got that one bit here. Because, of course, you can see at the top in the bold print, Judith Reigl is introduced. And it is as part of the conversation that those memories come forth. And what it says here is, and I think it's so interesting, and of course her title, Real-Time Legal Time, is interesting. The French ambassador yesterday was telling me how very complex the tenses in Hungarian are to do with time. And, you know, there's living time, remembered time, tense time, legal time. However, she's introduced with these words, Judith Reigl's progress is one of the most exemplary here in Europe. A trajectory through history from east to west, as the text we publish reveals. A trajectory through modernity, contacts with surrealism, with American abstraction. Here, I just continue to read here. Here, Judith gives another description of her bi-faced canvases of the Déroulement series. And here she is in front of one of these déroulements, which, like the idea of stamping on a canvas so the paint goes right through it, these are works which function on both sides, and she works on both sides of the canvas. So here she gives another description of her, she says, bi-faced canvases of the Déroulement series, where the processes of repulsion and absorption create saturated or stratified layers. The other side of the canvas implies the frontier to traverse. She describes her anxious watching, this is while she's painting, for the moment of an unstable, precarious equilibrium, the moment to stop the painting. This is another moment we can't see. Every painting in the show has had a moment when it was stopped. The moment to stop the painting, suspend time on the frontier between birth and death. And it is when she said that, when she's talked about this process of time and stopping time and the two sides to her painting, that's the moment when she suddenly recalls and allows this recollection to be printed. This is the moment when she recalls the escape from Hungary. The frontier suddenly recalls the Iron Curtain, heralding the now much quoted tale of escape through the Hungarian night, a minefield traversed by walking with a ladder post on the ground, small orange-yellow squares shining in the blackness, like flashes in her paintings, which signal future safety, the express train leaving from Budapest. And this is where she says she'll become neither exile, emigrant, or immigrant transnational. She says the ladder becomes the real instrument of traversal, and this is so interesting as well, from the domain of my mother tongue to the level et langue. This means sort of without languages, but it's a word like elated and things as well. It's extremely complex, this made-up word she uses. These are the languages of my painting, she says. And then she talks at the end about the passage of darkness into light and finding love and a vita nuova. She uses the actual analogy of Dante and Dante's vita nuova. And of course, she is reunited with Betty. So there is this love story happening as well in this. But I think this is why the context and what we learn from the context is so interesting. And it's interesting that in this feminist review, she allows this to happen. On the one hand, she is saturated with the language of psychoanalysis, the language of Bataille, the language of Plenay, the language of Julia Kristeva. They all have a kind of intertextual and interlinguistic relationship with each other. But there are other artists too who are her contemporaries with whom she shares traumatic experience. And I wanted just to show you one or two of these because I talk about these as well in my text, but I'm sure they're not going to be illustrated. For example, Ruth Franken, whom I knew before I knew Judith and who's now died, who was a gestural painter as well, and who was an exile in as much as she was from Prague and went to New York and came back to Paris. She was written about by Jean-François Lyotard just before he wrote about his very famous book Heidegger and the Jews, because it's through her story that Lyotard learnt a kind of Jewish story, if you like. But in her gestural paintings, skulls come back. In the mid-1960s, having left surrealism, just like Judith, having become a gesturalist. And it's exactly like Judith's paintings, which are called Expérience d'apaisanteur, experience of weightlessness, where you have the void. The void is one of the titles of this exhibition, the void, and the void becoming a skull. So this parallel is very interesting. The way that things are coming through the canvas. And the same if you think not of a female contemporary, and this painter is senior to her, but another painter with whom she shared a gallery, Zoran Muzic, another painter whom I knew for many, many years. I had a very long relationship from 1980 with, not a very close relationship, but a constant relationship with him as a person until his death. And he was somebody who was from, like Judith, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he'd been trained in painting academies, not just in Hungary, but in many different academies. And then he had had this terrible experience. He was from Trieste, as well, near Trieste. And he'd also begun as a painter of churches, so he had a kind of ecclesiastical background as well. And what is so strange, and he gave me a little watercolour like this, these are paintings which corroborated all the abstract desires of the Galerie de France, which wanted to show abstract painting. The Galerie de France with which Judith is still associated. And yet, these paintings of the Cumbrian landscapes in Italy, the Cumbrian hills. In 1972 to 76, just at the moment before that art press article, those images, those stones become heaps of skulls again. And he paints this very famous series called We Are Not the Last, Nous ne sommes pas les derniers, non solo gli ultimi. And so this idea of trauma coming through the canvas is something which, in an inexplicit, very possibly inexplicit, but shared way, far beyond the concerns, of course, of the American painters with whom she's been constantly compared. She's been compared with Barnett Newman. I've also brought up Agnes Martin. But far beyond that, she shares this very deep European experience. I'm afraid this was one of the only images I could find of Alina Shapoknikov, who was also shown, but posthumously, tragically, in 1972, before Judith, at the Musée de la Ville de Paris by Suzanne Paget. And what's interesting here is the kind of sexy 60s, 70s image compared with these bits of wrinkled, poured, synthetic kind of leathery plastic. She actually is the person who inspired Armand to pourings. If you look at this thing up there with the kind of blood running from it, there's a great relationship in her work to Polish 19th century symbolism. But the way that these works evolved into something like this is part of her Tumors series. I was able to show her in Paris Capital of the Arts before she exploded onto the feminist scene, because after my show she was shown in a group show in Vienna, and after that she was picked up by the Americans. All the work which my Polish students know was mouldering in corridors, unloved and in bad condition in Polish museums, suddenly was all restored, and you have a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. These are the tumor works done with a kind of plastic and relating to body parts. You can see this breast here that relate to her own cancer. And she was somebody who, as a very young woman, had been saved from extermination in Theresienstadt because her mother was a doctor and she helped her mother. So she too, like Musich, had a dark concentration camp experience which she did not talk about. So there is this, not only the solidarity in the context of women's retrospectives, but this unspoken bond between women who were Judith's contemporaries, maybe not her friends, but who were her contemporaries, which I think is very interesting. And against this, of course, there were these big, big groups of male artists. This is a commemorative picture of the guys, but the photographs are of the period of the Support Surface group, and there are their names at the top, which are always read out like this, always working with the strength of a group behind them, with whom Judith was, if you like, in very deliberate competition with her drap découdage. They used unstretched canvas, unsupported canvas, with these very heavy manifestos, with the backing of Telquel, Plenet, and so forth. So really, I just wanted to remind you of this moment and this coming through the canvas of what I consider Judith's most magnificent and poignant and moving series, and the notion of reversal and back to front and lightness and resurrection, rebirth, and the sense of this ethereal man being also the cover-up for the menacing torso in space. Obviously, I'm not dealing with the rest of her career, but I must say that when I went to see her, I was so shocked and amazed by seeing her most recent work,